The last thing Jackson Keller expected at midnight was to find a woman in heels and a silk dress standing alone outside a gas station, hugging herself against the cold. He was running late again. The sitter was only paid until 12:30, and his 8-year-old son, Parker, had school in the morning. Jackson had just finished his third ride of the night for the car service he worked with part-time, and he'd promised himself this would be the last. But when he saw her shivering, barefoot now, her heels dangling from her fingers, he sighed and pulled over. "Everything okay?" he asked, rolling down the window of his beat-up sedan. She turned slowly, her long dark hair catching the wind. Her eyes were a deep gray, the kind that made you pause without knowing why. Her red lipstick was slightly smeared, and she looked tired. But not the kind of tired that came from a bad day. The kind that came from carrying too much for too long. "I left a party," she said softly. "I just needed to get away." He glanced at the empty passenger seat. "Need a ride?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. If you don't mind." Jackson leaned over and unlocked the door. "Hop in." She slid into the seat, folding her dress beneath her. It was black, fitted, and looked like it cost more than his monthly rent. Still, she didn't act like someone who cared about that. She just gave him a quiet, grateful smile. "I'm Jackson, by the way." She hesitated. Whitney Dalton." He nodded, pulling out onto the road. "Where to, Whitney?" She gave him an address in the Upper East Side. He blinked. "That's a long way from here." "I'll pay you double," she said quickly. He didn't answer right away. He thought of Parker, probably asleep by now. The sitter, Mrs. Langley, would understand if he was a little late. They needed the money. "All right," Jackson said. "Let's get you home." They drove in silence for a while, the hum of the road filling the space between them. Whitney stared out the window, her hands folded in her lap. "You okay?" he asked after a few blocks. She gave a small laugh, but it didn't sound amused. "Yeah, just had one of those nights where you realize people don't care about you. Just your last name." He glanced at her. "You've got one of those names, huh? You could say that." "Well, for what it's worth, I didn't know your name 10 minutes ago, and I still pulled over." She looked at him then. Her eyes softened. "Thank you for that." They passed a diner with flickering neon lights. Without really thinking, he turned into the lot and parked. Whitney raised a brow. "What are we doing? You look like you could use coffee. And pancakes. Just 10 minutes. My treat." Her lips parted in surprise. "You don't even know me." Jackson shrugged. "You're sitting in my car at midnight with no shoes." "Feels like we're past that now." She stared at him for a second longer, then smiled. "All right, 10 minutes." The diner was half empty. They slid into a booth, and Jackson ordered coffee and pancakes for both of them. Whitney sipped hers slowly. "You always this nice to strangers?" He smiled. "Only the ones who look like they ran away from a gala and ended up at a gas station." She laughed. Really laughed this time. It lit up her whole face. "I needed that," she said softly. Jackson looked at her, really looked. There was something about her that pulled at him. Not just the dress or the makeup or the way she carried herself. It was the way she looked like she was holding herself together with string. "What happened tonight?" he asked gently. Whitney hesitated. Then, like a dam breaking, she spoke. "My father threw a party tonight. For investors. People who throw money at our company like it's a game. He introduced me to a man he wants me to merge 2 fortunes," he said. "Like I'm a chess piece." Jackson's jaw tensed. "You said no?" "I walked out." Her eyes met his. "I didn't even take my driver. I just needed to feel like a person again." He nodded slowly. "Well, tonight. You're just Whitney." She smiled again. "And you're just Jackson." They finished their pancakes, and he drove her the rest of the way to her apartment building. When she stepped out, she turned to him. "Thank you. For the ride. For the pancakes." He nodded. "You sure you're all right?" She nodded. "I will be." Then, to his surprise, she leaned in and kissed his cheek. "Good night, Jackson Keller." He watched her disappear into the building, then drove home in silence. By the time he got back, Parker was asleep on the couch, a blanket tucked around him. Jackson carried him to bed, kissed his forehead, and stood by the door for a long minute. He didn't know who Whitney Dalton really was, but something in his gut told him this wasn't the last time he'd see her, and he had no idea she was already in love with him. Jackson didn't see Whitney again for 2 weeks. Not at the gas station, not at the diner, not in the back of his car. She was gone, like a strange dream he'd had after a long shift. He told himself it didn't matter, people came and went. He wasn't in the business of chasing women who wore $1,000 dresses and lived behind doormen. But then Tuesday came, and with it, a flat tire on the way to pick up Parker from school. He was crouched on the side of the road, trying to loosen a rusted lug nut with a wrench that felt like it might snap in half, when a black SUV slowed beside him. "Need a hand?" came a voice he didn't expect. He looked up, squinting against the sun. Whitney stood on the curb, wearing jeans, a simple blouse, and flats. No makeup, no gown, just her. Jackson stood, wiping his hands on a rag. "You drive that thing?" She tilted her head. "I own it. Carl drives." A man in a dark jacket stepped out of the SUV and opened the door for her. She waved him off. Jackson leaned against the dented hood of his car. "You stalking me now?" Whitney gave a half shrug. "I Googled your last name. Took a while. But your car is registered to a Jackson Keller. Once I had the name, it wasn't hard." He crossed his arms. "You went through all that trouble just to find me? I owed you breakfast. I didn't do it for a reward." "I know," she said. "That's why I came back." He stared at her. "You're not exactly who you pretended to be." "I never pretended. I just didn't volunteer." "What are you doing here, Whitney?" She stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "You treated me like I mattered. Not because of my last name. Not because of what I could offer. Just me." He didn't answer. She walked past him and knelt by the tire. "You're not going to fix this with that wrench. It's stripped. I don't exactly have a garage full of tools lying around." She stood and dusted off her hands. "Get in. I'll take you to the school. I can't leave the car here. I already texted Carl. He's calling a tow." He hesitated, but Parker couldn't be left waiting. Inside the SUV was soft leather and cold air conditioning. She handed him a bottle of water without a word. He accepted it, still uncertain. After a few minutes, he glanced over. "Why are you really here?" Whitney turned to him. "You were the only person in a long time who didn't want something from me. That stuck." He ran a hand through his hair. "You've got an entire world that I don't belong in." She looked out the window. "Maybe I'm tired of that world." They pulled up to the school just as Parker came out the front doors, his backpack nearly dragging on the ground. Jackson stepped out quickly. "Parker, over here." The boy ran over, blinking up at the massive SUV. "Whoa, new car, Dad." Jackson glanced at Whitney, who only smiled. "No, buddy, just borrowing it." Parker looked at her curiously. "Hi." Whitney crouched slightly. "Hey there. I'm Whitney." "You're pretty," he said bluntly. Jackson groaned. "Parker," Whitney laughed. "Thank you. You're very charming." Parker turned to his dad. "Can she come to dinner?" Jackson stared at him, then at her. Whitney raised a brow. "I'd love to." Jackson opened his mouth, but no sound came out. She leaned closer. "Unless you're scared of letting me see your cooking skills." He snorted. "I don't cook. I microwave. I'm a fan of burnt edges." That night, Whitney sat at their tiny kitchen table while Jackson stirred spaghetti in a battered pot. Parker quizzed her on dinosaurs while she helped him set the table. "You ever eat spaghetti with ketchup?" Parker asked. Whitney blinked. "I haven't had the pleasure." "You're in for a treat," Jackson said dryly. Dinner was chaotic. The sauce was too salty. The bread was overdone. But Whitney didn't complain. She laughed. She listened. She asked questions. And she didn't flinch when Jackson told her about Parker's mom walking out 5 years ago. When Parker finally crashed on the couch, Whitney helped gather the dishes. "You didn't have to do that," Jackson said as she stacked the plates. "I wanted to." He leaned against the counter. "You're not what I expected." "Neither are you." She dried her hands. "I should go." He followed her to the door. "Thanks for dinner." "And the ride." She paused, turning to face him. "I'm going to be honest. I don't date." "Not really. People see the name and forget I'm a person." "I don't date either," he said. "Not a lot of time between raising a kid and fixing busted tires." She looked up at him. "So maybe we don't call it a date. What do we call it?" She smiled. "Let's just call it something." He nodded slowly. "All right. Something." She leaned in and kissed him, not on the cheek this time. Just a soft brush of her lips against his. Then she turned and left, leaving the faint scent of vanilla and promise behind her. Jackson stood at the door long after she was gone, heart pounding like he'd just run 5 miles. He didn't know what this was, but it wasn't nothing. The next time Jackson saw Whitney, she wasn't in jeans or a cocktail dress. She was pacing outside a courthouse in navy slacks and a tailored blouse, Her phone clenched in one hand and a strained look on her face. He hadn't expected to see her there. He was stepping onto the sidewalk with Parker's school permission forms in a manila envelope under one arm, squinting at the glare off the marble building. She didn't see him at first. Did he really just walk out? She asked into the phone, her voice tight. No, I don't care if he was offended. He was paid to stay. She turned then, catching sight of Jackson. Her expression shifted relief first, then uncertainty. She ended the call with a clipped word and lowered the phone. What are you doing here? She asked, forcing a calmness that didn't reach her eyes. Filed Parker's school paperwork. He got into the science program. He nodded toward the envelope. Couldn't risk sending it by mail. Whitney blinked, then offered a small nod. That's good. He'll like that. You all right? Jackson asked, taking in the rigid set of her shoulders. My attorney bailed 15 minutes before a family arbitration hearing, she said flatly. Apparently, he didn't like being reminded who pays his retainer. That sounds like a mess. It's my father, she said after a beat, trying to freeze my trust until I agree to let him restructure the board. He says I'm being unreasonable for refusing to hand over controlling shares. Jackson frowned. Is that even legal? With the right judge and enough money? Almost anything is. He studied her face. What do you need? She looked up, startled by the simplicity of the question. I don't know. A lawyer who isn't afraid of him. A lobotomy. A decent coffee. Take your pick. I can get you coffee, he said. She gave a short laugh, but it carried no humor. You're the only person I've seen all day who doesn't want a piece of something. That's rare. Maybe you've been looking in the wrong rooms. They walked in silence toward the corner where his car was parked. She didn't say anything until they reached the passenger side. You know, I could have had someone send that paperwork for you. I know, he said, but I don't want Parker thinking he has to depend on someone else to do what I can. Whitney nodded slowly. You're not like anyone I know. That's starting to feel mutual. They ended up at a cafe tucked between a dry cleaner and a bookstore. Jackson ordered 2 coffees and a lemon tart. Parker liked to save for weekends. Whitney added a cranberry muffin to the tray and paid before he could protest. They sat at a corner table beneath a window streaked with the beginnings of rain. I never asked, she said, stirring her drink, what you did before driving. Construction, he said. Carpentry mostly. Got laid off during the slowdown. Then the site closed. Haven't been back since. Do you miss it? Sometimes, he said. But Parker needed stability more than I needed pride. So I picked up driving. It's flexible. Pays enough to keep us fed. Whitney traced the rim of her cup. That's honest and kind of humbling. Jackson tilted his head. You say that like you've never gone without something. I haven't, she said. Not really. I've never worried about rent. Or groceries. I've never had to decide between a doctor visit and a phone bill. He didn't judge her for it, just watched her carefully. Then why do you look like you're the one barely staying afloat? She looked away. Because I have everything I was taught to want, and none of it feels like mine. They sat in silence for a long moment. The rain tapped against the glass, soft and steady. Finally, she turned back to him. I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer like you're not trying to protect my feelings. He raised a brow. All right. If someone like me stepped out of that world, if I walked away from the money, the board seats, the legacy, what would I be? He looked at her for a long time. You'd be someone who finally stopped running from herself. She blinked, caught off guard. You think you're only valuable because of what you come with, he continued. But I met you without any of it. And I still wanted you at my table. She swallowed. You say that like it's easy. I don't think it's easy. I just think it's honest. Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't look at it. Instead, she leaned forward, elbows on the table. What if I told you I want to disappear from it all for a while? No drivers. No investors. Just somewhere quiet. Somewhere I can think. I'd ask where you're going. And if I said I wanted you to come? He hesitated. Parker's got school. She nodded. Right. Of course. But spring break is in 2 weeks, he added. I could take a few days. If we're invited. Her lips parted slightly. You'd really bring him? He's part of the deal. Can't have one without the other. She smiled then, not the careful kind she wore in public, but something real. I wouldn't want it any other way. When they left the cafe, she didn't call for her driver. She walked beside him in the rain, no umbrella, her heels clicking softly on the wet sidewalk. Back at his car, she paused. I have to go back in, she said. Face the board. Pretend I care about the quarterly margins. I know, but when I get out, I'll call you. I'll answer. She reached up and touched his jaw. Thank you for reminding me who I actually am. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She turned and walked away, and Jackson stood there for a long time, watching the woman who could buy anything but trusted him with the one thing she didn't hand out freely: herself. The cottage Whitney rented sat on the edge of a quiet lake, tucked behind rows of pine trees that filtered the afternoon sun into gold-tinted stripes. It was early April, and the air was still cool enough that Parker wore a hoodie when he chased dragonflies near the water's edge, but warm enough that Jackson didn't worry about him catching cold. Whitney had disappeared into the kitchen after they arrived, claiming she wanted to try something she'd read about lemon herb chicken in a cast-iron skillet. Jackson had offered to help, but she waved him off, saying it was her turn to cook for once. Do you think she knows what a cast-iron skillet actually is? Jackson asked Parker, who was crouched in the grass inspecting a beetle. She owns a robot vacuum that talks, Parker said without glancing up. She'll figure it out. Jackson leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed, watching the boy with a complicated kind of pride. This little lake trip had been exactly what they needed. What he hadn't expected was how easily Whitney slipped into it. She hadn't brought an assistant or a planner or even a laptop, just a duffel bag, a pair of hiking boots, and a stack of books she'd admitted she hadn't read since college. Dinner's in 20, Whitney called from the doorway, holding a wooden spoon like a baton. And I swear if either of you says it's too salty, I'm switching careers. Parker dashed past Jackson toward the cabin, shouting something about dibs on the seat closest to the bread. Jackson followed, not rushing. The smell of garlic and lemon drifted through the air as he stepped inside. The table was set mismatched plates, linen napkins she'd ironed herself. A candle flickered beside a bowl of salad, and 2 glasses were already filled with sparkling water and lime slices. You're showing off, he said as he sat down. I'll deny everything, Whitney replied, setting the chicken on a trivet in the center. Over dinner, Parker chatted about school, describing a science experiment where they'd built paper bridges to hold pennies. Whitney asked questions, not just to be polite, but because she genuinely wanted to know. She listened with her whole face, nodding thoughtfully, even asking if she could help him build one of his paper bridges tomorrow. By the time the plates were cleared and Parker had wandered off to read on the couch, Whitney poured 2 cups of tea and joined Jackson on the porch. Not bad for someone who once burned microwave popcorn, she said, nudging his knee with hers. He took a sip of tea. I didn't say anything about the salt. She laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that came from a full heart instead of amusement. The sky had turned a soft gray blue, and the lake reflected the colors like a mirror. I had a meeting with my father before we left, she said after a moment. Jackson turned his head toward her. How'd it go? He offered to buy out my shares. Said I could have a house in the Hamptons, a monthly allowance, and a clean exit if I gave him full control. Jackson didn't say anything. I told him no, she continued. I said I wanted to keep building the parts of the company that actually mattered. The charity wing, the clean energy investments. I want to make something that feels like mine. Jackson set his cup down. That's a big move. I knew it would cost me, Whitney said, but I didn't expect it to feel like a relief. He reached over and took her hand. She didn't flinch or pull away. Her fingers curled around his naturally, like they'd been doing it for years. What does it mean for you now? He asked. It means I'm not going back to that boardroom, she said. Not on his terms. I'm looking at starting something separate. Smaller. Real. Jackson raised an eyebrow. Real. Something that doesn't require designer gowns and champagne galas. Something that impacts lives like yours. Like Parker's. He held her gaze. You sure you're ready for that? I've never been more sure of anything, she said. Parker called from inside, asking if they were going to play cards like they said they would. Whitney stood first, but before stepping inside, she turned back. I know this started as something unexpected, she said, but I want it to be something permanent. Jackson stepped closer. You're not just saying that because we're in a pretty cabin and the world feels far away? No, she said. I'm saying it because I've seen the world and this is the only part of it that's made me feel like I belong. The screen door creaked as Parker leaned out. You coming or what? Whitney reached for Jackson's hand again. Let's go win. Later that night, After Parker had fallen asleep with a deck of cards on his chest and crumbs from too many cookies on his shirt, Jackson found Whitney standing barefoot on the porch, wrapped in an old flannel blanket she'd found in the closet. "You know," she said, "I used to think love was something that had to come with contracts and intentions and prenups. And now I think it's a kid asking if I'll come to his spelling bee, a man who doesn't care about last names, and dinner that might be too salty but still perfect." Jackson stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. She leaned back into him, and for a while, they just listened to the frogs by the lake and the wind rustling through the trees. "I want to stay," she said softly. He rested his chin on her shoulder. "Then stay. Not just here. With you. With him. I want to build a life that doesn't need to be hidden behind boardrooms or bodyguards." He turned her gently until they were face to face. "Then let's build it," he said. "Together." Whitney's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. "You're sure?" "I loved you before I knew who you were," Jackson said. "And now that I do, I'd marry you tomorrow if you let me." She laughed, and this time, it was joy, unfiltered and full. "Good. Because I already bought Parker a tie." He grinned. "You what?" "For the courthouse wedding," she said. "I figured you'd say yes." Jackson kissed her then, slow and certain, under the stars and the scent of pine, knowing for the first time in years that whatever came next they'd face it together. And 1 week later, before a justice of the peace and an 8-year-old in a clip-on tie holding a ring box upside down, Jackson Keller married the billionaire who'd once climbed into his car barefoot and exhausted. And she never stopped choosing him. Not once. Not ever. The courthouse wedding had been quiet, simple, and exactly what they needed. But now, 3 months later, Whitney stood barefoot in the middle of the kitchen, flour on her cheek, and a mixing bowl cradled in her arms, watching Parker try to crack eggs without dropping shell into the batter. "Gentle," she instructed, holding the bowl steady. "Like you're convincing the egg to cooperate." "I'm trying," Parker muttered, tongue poking out in concentration. "But it's slippery." "You're doing great," Jackson said as he entered, setting 2 paper bags on the counter. "Flowers on your face again, Whit." She wiped at her cheek with the back of her wrist and shrugged. "It's part of the aesthetic." Jackson kissed her forehead, then began unpacking groceries. "You bought every lemon in the store?" "I'm experimenting with a lavender lemonade," she said. "It's for the open house tomorrow." "Are people actually going to show up?" Parker asked, finally cracking an egg cleanly. "What if no one comes?" Whitney leaned down to meet his eyes. "They will. We've invited every family from the after-school program, and the new community kitchen already has 30 volunteers signed up." Jackson pulled out a stack of flyers from the bag and handed them to Parker. "Think you can help me hand these out after breakfast?" Parker grinned. "If I get another one of those raspberry muffins, I'll hand-deliver them on a scooter." Whitney tousled his hair. "Deal." The community center had been Whitney's idea. Not the board-approved kind with gold plaques and overpaid consultants, but a real place, in a real neighborhood, built with the money she pulled from her shares and the backing of people who believed in her vision. It had classrooms, a food pantry, and space for single parents to access legal aid and childcare. Jackson had helped renovate the building himself, working late into the night with local contractors who volunteered their weekends. She stirred the batter gently, watching the boy who had become an anchor in her life. Parker had started calling her Whit without hesitation, and while he hadn't used the word mom, he'd taken her hand in crowded places without thinking, and once, when he'd bumped his knee, he'd leaned into her shoulder without being asked. That was enough. Later that afternoon, Jackson stood in the sun-drenched courtyard of the new center, watching Whitney walk a group of volunteers through tomorrow's schedule. She wore jeans, a t-shirt with the name of the center screen printed across the chest, and a lanyard with a schedule clipped to it. Her hair was pulled back, and she looked completely at ease. "You know," he said as she approached him, "I don't think I've ever seen you this happy." She glanced around the courtyard. "I've never had something that felt like mine before. Not like this. You built it." "That's more than most people can say." She tilted her head, studying him. "You're a part of this too. Don't forget that." He slipped an arm around her waist. "I haven't forgotten anything. Especially not the part where you nearly burned your eyebrows off trying to light that first industrial stove." "That was one time," she said, laughing. "And you were the one who told me the gas line was fine." "I said it looked fine. I didn't say you should test it with a match. They stood there a moment, the sound of Parker's laughter echoing from inside. He was helping one of the volunteers decorate the front windows with paper cutouts. I have something for you, Whitney said suddenly. Jackson turned as she reached into the bag she'd slung over her shoulder. She pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to him. He opened it, brow furrowing. Is this a deed? It's the cottage. I bought it. In both our names. He blinked. You didn't have to. I wanted to, she said. It's where we started. It should be ours. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his back pocket. You're aware you've officially become the woman who buys real estate as a romantic gesture, right? She grinned. I've always been a little dramatic. I like that about you, he said. It keeps things interesting. The day of the open house arrived with clear skies and a line of families waiting to enter before the doors even opened. Jackson stood by the entrance with Parker, both in matching navy t-shirts with the center's logo. Whitney floated between groups, answering questions, introducing neighbors, and guiding kids to the craft tables. By noon, the food tables were half empty, and volunteers were already setting up for afternoon classes. A local news station had shown up uninvited, and Whitney didn't flinch when they asked for an interview. I was raised in a world where money was power, she told the reporter calmly. But I've learned that real power is in connection and community. This place isn't about charity. It's about building something together. Jackson watched her speak, his chest tightening with something almost too big to name. Pride, love, it all swirled into something that made him feel like his feet were planted exactly where they were meant to be. That night, after the cleanup was finished and Parker had been tucked into bed with a comic book under his pillow, Whitney joined Jackson on the porch of the cottage. She held 2 mugs of tea and handed one to him. I still think about that night at the gas station. He took a sip. You mean the one where you looked like a runway model and nearly froze to death? I mean the one where someone saw me, she said. Past the noise. Past the name. Jackson leaned in, brushing her hair back from her face. I saw a woman who didn't know how extraordinary she was. You helped me become someone I actually like, she said. Not just someone people admire. You were always that person, he said. You just needed someone to remind you. She lifted her chin slightly. Are you going to keep reminding me? For the rest of my life, he said without hesitation. She kissed him then, soft and certain, under the same stars that once watched over them on a porch like this one. Only now, everything was different because everything was theirs. The cottage, the community center, the quiet mornings with Parker's cereal bowls still on the table, the future they were building day by day. And they never looked back. Not once. Not ever.